The kinetic reality of naval combat in June of 1864 reduced complex geopolitics to simple ballistic geometry. The Confederate commerce raider Alabama engaged the Union vessel Kearsarge several miles off Cherbourg in the English Channel, beyond the harbor mouth but still under the eyes of the French coast. The operational design of Alabama gave special importance to her two heavy pivot guns, mounted fore and aft along the ship's centerline. This engineering configuration allowed heavy ordnance to be trained toward either the port or starboard side, increasing tactical flexibility without turning the entire vessel into a conventional broadside platform alone. Forward, the ship carried a 7-inch Blakely rifled muzzleloader. Aft, she carried an 8-inch, 68-pounder smoothbore, which some technical assessments regard as her most formidable weapon. During the spiraling, roughly hour-long artillery duel, the Alabama achieved one of the most dramatic hits of the battle. Her crew fired a Blakely shell that struck Kearsarge near the stern, glanced across the counter, and finally lodged in the stern post. The impact damaged the steering enough that more men were needed at the wheel, and semis and later storytellers treated the dud as a terrifying near miss. Because the shell never burst, however, its larger tactical effect remains an informed counterfactual rather than a certainty. Instead, the inert mass of iron remained lodged in the wooden structure as a famous relic of the duel. That failure mattered, but it did not by itself dictate the destruction of the raider. Kearsarge survived because she combined better condition, better gunnery, a speed advantage, and two much heavier 11-inch Dahlgren pivot guns. The Union crew used those advantages to batter the Confederate vessel with deliberate, damaging fire. The incoming heavy projectiles tore into Alabama at and near the waterline. Flooding spread fast, the ship careened heavily to starboard, and the chief engineer reported that the fires were out and the engines could no longer be worked. As the hull filled, the stern settled lower and lower until the stern port was almost at the water's edge. Then Alabama went down stern foremost, her bows rising high before she disappeared beneath the waves off the French coast. The combat engagement was definitively concluded, but the exact geographic coordinates where the shattered hull ultimately settled in the chaotic environment of the channel remained a completely open question. The immense hydrodynamic barrier of the English Channel kept the wreckage unverified and effectively beyond sustained archaeological access for 120 years. In late 1984, the French Navy minehunter Circe located a wreck off Cherbourg that Captain Max Guéroux later confirmed as Alabama. Some later French public material describes the discovery as 1985. The target rested on the seabed in roughly 60 meters, or about 200 feet, of water deep enough to demand decompression discipline and specialized support. But depth itself was not the primary antagonist. The primary constraint was kinetic. Off northern France, the seabed funnels tidal water into bottom currents reaching up to 4 knots across the wreckage. That moving pressure strips away thermal protection in 50-degree water, exhausts human muscles, and tears at umbilical lines and primary diving equipment. At peak flow, the site was not survivable. Access depended on the slack tide window. During that brief equilibrium, the current dropped just enough for a temporary descent to the wreck. French accounts describe dives limited to low tide and neap water, leaving teams only about a quarter of an hour on the wreck because decompression stops consumed the rest of the dive. Once the tide shifted back into motion, the water column could separate a working diver from the surface support vessel, so every descent had to be synchronized with the tide. Surface teams watched the flow over the wreck, waited for the drop, sent the divers down, and called them back before the window closed. Delayed decisions, entangled lifelines, or equipment malfunctions could turn the window into a direct survival problem. Those limits proved a physical wreck existed in the sector, but mere minutes of bottom observation left a forensic gap. The team still had to prove the wooden vessel's historical identity before legal declarations or operational plans could proceed. The next problem was identification, not discovery. The primary verification expedition launched in 1988 had to secure unassailable forensic proof through a disciplined process of hypothesis elimination. The initial verification work centered on volunteer divers, archaeologists, and historians working with Captain Max Guéroux. Later campaigns also used ROV documentation, but the decisive identity breakthrough came from divers physically working the wreck. Navigating the completely dark, heavily scoured wreckage required immense structural discipline and spatial awareness. The teams deliberately bypassed the horizontal steam machinery, including the two-cylinder condensing engine and boilers, along with the more confused forward wreckage, and concentrated instead on the command sector. The search grid carried them into the aft section, where the primary helm area once stood during active combat. Operating in total darkness and relying heavily on tactical dive lights, the divers manually swept the heavy ocean sediment away from the buried steering mechanisms. In the steering gear debris, the team found Alabama's wheel. Once cleaned aboard the surface vessel, its brass ring revealed the French motto, Aide-toi et Dieu t'aidera. In English, the phrase means, God helps those who help themselves, because that inscription was the documented and globally recognized mantra of the notorious Confederate raider. The wheel closed the hypothesis elimination phase of the project. The anonymous target buried at the bottom of the English Channel became a verified historical record of one of the most successful commerce raiders in global naval history, and that certainty immediately generated a jurisdictional crisis. The question was absolute legal ownership. Who could claim a sunken military warship of a defeated rebel nation that no longer existed? Verification transformed the legal status of the vessel, which rested entirely within the 12-mile territorial limit of the French Republic. However, the deep site was rapidly facing total structural collapse, forcing the international legal parameters to evolve precisely as fast as the hostile physical environment degraded the remaining organic timbers. The preservation threat was physical as much as legal. The powerful bottom currents drive a dense, abrasive mix of rocks, pebbles, shell hash, and sand across the open wreck site. This moving sediment scours exposed wooden timbers, stripping away fragile outer layers with the brutal efficiency of industrial sandpaper. Shifting deposits of shell hash and sand can also cover working areas and force archaeologists to re-establish access after the bottom changes. That loss risk made clear legal authority necessary to fund and organize controlled intervention. The legal argument relied heavily on sovereign succession, but not as a simple erasure of every complication. Because Alabama had been a public warship of the Confederacy, the United States asserted that title passed to the federal government after the Civil War. Later litigation over Alabama's belle upheld United States title by succession and rejected private salvage claims. The result was historically paradoxical. The defeated rebel vessel became protected property of the government it had spent its operational life fighting. Recognizing the urgent physical crisis playing out on the dark sea floor, the two nations engaged in rapid, highly focused diplomatic negotiations. On 3 October 1989, the United States and France signed an executive agreement concerning the wreck. The agreement treated Alabama as a shared historic heritage resource, created a joint French and American scientific committee, and recognized that the wreck lay inside French territorial waters and remained subject to French law. France's later diplomatic recognition of United States ownership clarified the title question, while the joint management system controlled access against unauthorized salvage and commercial looting. Access was now controlled through that joint system. The law was settled, but the ocean still controlled the work. The combined engineering teams now faced the operational problem of extracting the heaviest military hardware before shifting bottom deposits buried the critical weapons. The recovery operation began with a geometric trap. Heavy iron had to come free without wrecking the wooden site. The complex 1994 recovery operation focused on the heavy Blakely rifle, a weapon of more than 3 tons mounted on a wooden pivot carriage near the forward machinery. The gun was accessible enough to attempt, but the team had to remove it quickly without damaging the wreck around it. The solution avoided brute force dredging or a crane drag from above. The team fixed a 45-meter cable to the gun, attached a 5,000-liter airbag, inflated it in roughly 15 meters of water, and used the French naval vessel La Fidèle to work with the current rather than directly against it. The gun and carriage formed an asymmetric load, so divers had to secure the lifting straps around buried metal components in near darkness, with sediment moving blindingly through the water, and calculate the center of gravity before the lift. If the heavy rigging failed during the primary vertical lift, or if the massive load shifted unexpectedly due to slightly improper strap placement, the multi-ton hardware would crash violently back down through the fragile remains of the lower wooden hull, destroying the archaeological site instantly and potentially crushing the working divers. The rigging had to hold the first time. Remote systems and other specialized equipment supported documentation and planning across the broader project, but the Blakely lift itself depended on divers placing slings, the airbag system, and La Fidèle working with the current. When the system was ready, the recovery moved fast. The final ascent of the gun took roughly 20 minutes. The gun came clear of the surrounding shell hash and sand without tearing through the structural remains. The 7-inch rifle reached the surface and was transferred for conservation, preserving one of the most symbolically lethal components of the famous Commerce Raider. After the gun recoveries and selected artifact work, the remaining wooden hull became the final question. Protecting the primary physical structure of a globally famous warship while preserving human life and recovered historical artifacts required a strict operational trade-off. The later phases of the international project did not mark a simple permanent shutdown of all intrusive work. Instead, the site was managed as a controlled archaeological landscape. Survey, documentation, limited excavation, and selected recovery continued when those actions served preservation and research goals and were authorized by both governments. Over the regulated expeditions, French and American teams recovered combat ordnance, ship fittings, the ship's bell, machinery-related components, personal objects, and ceramic tableware used by the Confederate crew. These meticulous surgical recoveries completely fulfilled the primary forensic and historical goals established by the Joint Scientific Committee. The primary structural footprint presented a different problem from the portable artifacts. That left the hull itself to be judged by archaeology, engineering, and risk. The exposed wooden remains had been weakened by biological activity, abrasion, and long saltwater immersion, while buried sections still preserved important archaeological information. Raising the hull was not pursued because the site was deep, current-swept, fragile, and scientifically valuable in place. Any large-scale lift risked destroying context, damaging surviving structure, and placing divers where rescue options were severely constrained. Facing these physical, mechanical, and ethical limits, the project favored controlled in situ protection and selective, justified recovery rather than an attempt to raise the wreck. The remaining structure stayed in place by design, not by neglect. The operation achieved its forensic and historical goals without forcing a catastrophic hull lift. The surviving hull of the Confederate vessel is best understood as mostly left in situ on the dark, violent channel floor. Respected as a historical legacy, protected by French law and by United States ownership, closed to public diving and accessible only through authorized archaeological work rather than commercial salvage.